The surf crashed against the hull of the Higgins boat as First Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky gripped the sides, his knuckles white beneath the grime and salt spray. It was 8:44 inches the morning on June 15th. And 300 yards ahead lay the beaches of Saipan, where Japanese artillery shells were already churning the water into geysers of white foam and debris. Behind him sat 40 men, and every single one of them had been pulled from the brig or punishment details across the 2nd Marine Division. Every single one of them was exactly the kind of Marine the Corps typically tried to court-martial out of service. And every single one of them was exactly what Tachovsky needed. The 29-year-old officer from New Brighton, Pennsylvania, had handpicked these men over the past 6 months. When Colonel James Roosevelt Rizley had given him permission to form an elite scout sniper platoon after the bloodbath at Tarawa, Tachovsky hadn't gone looking for the best Marines. He'd gone looking for the worst. Or rather, for the men the Marine Corps considered the worst, but who possessed something far more valuable than obedience: the instinct to survive by any means necessary. 7 months earlier, Tarawa had been a massacre. 994 Marines killed in just 76 hours of fighting. The 2nd Marine Division had learned a brutal lesson. Frontal assaults against fortified Japanese positions produced mountains of American corpses. What they needed was intelligence. Real intelligence. Not grainy aerial photographs and optimistic estimates from staff officers who'd never set foot on a hostile beach. They needed men who could slip behind enemy lines, map Japanese fortifications, and report back so that naval gunfire and artillery could destroy those positions before Marines had to charge them head-on. Standard Marine training produced excellent riflemen and assault troops, men who could follow orders and execute battalion-sized attacks with precision. But Tachovsky needed something different. He needed men who thought for themselves, who ignored rules when survival demanded it, who understood that war wasn't about regulations and proper procedure. War was about killing the enemy before he killed you, and doing whatever it took to come home alive. So he'd visited the brigs. He'd walked past rows of Marines locked in cells for brawling, for theft, for insubordination. He'd developed a simple recruiting criterion. When 2 Marines got into a fight, the loser went to the infirmary while the winner went to the brig. Tachovsky wanted the winner. A man with a disciplinary record for fighting had proven he could handle himself in close combat. The Marine Corps called such men troublemakers. Tachovsky called them survivors. Over 2 months at Camp Tarawa in Hawaii, he'd assembled his platoon, 42 Marines from various punishment details, ranging in age from 17 to 34. Most had criminal records before joining the service. Several had been arrested for theft, assault, or worse. One had been a professional boxer who'd put 3 men in the hospital during a bar fight in Honolulu. Another had worked as a bodyguard for a Chicago gangster and knew 17 different ways to kill a man with his bare hands. A third had been dishonorably discharged from the Army before somehow talking his way into the Marines. The Marine Corps had given these men a choice: military prison or combat duty. They'd chosen combat, though some of them wondered afterward if they'd made the right decision. Training at Camp Tarawa had been unlike anything the regular Marine Corps taught. Silent killing techniques with knives and bare hands. How to approach a sentry from behind and snap his neck without making a sound. How to move through jungle terrain without disturbing vegetation, without leaving tracks, without being seen or heard. How to read Japanese maps and documents. How to call in naval gunfire and artillery strikes. How to shoot a man at 600 yards with an M1000 903 Springfield rifle, fitted with an 8-power unertl scope. They'd also learned to steal. Marines were notorious thieves by necessity in 1944. As the poorest equipped branch of the American military, they landed on Guadalcanal with leftover World War I gear, outdated weapons, and inadequate rations. To survive, Marines stole from better supplied Army and Navy units. Tachovsky's men had excelled at this particular skill. They'd raided Army supply depots for food, Navy warehouses for equipment, and even stolen jeeps and trucks. Other Marines in the 6th Regiment had nicknamed them the 40 Thieves. The name stuck. A Marine correspondent named Vic Kalman would later write in Leatherneck magazine, "Some of the craziest, fiercest, most lovable Marines on Saipan are in the Scout Sniper platoon under the command of 1st Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky. Tachovsky's terrors have wreaked havoc in, around, and mostly behind enemy lines." But on the morning of June 15th, as Japanese shells exploded in the surf around their Higgins boat, the 40 Thieves hadn't yet earned that reputation. This was their first combat operation, and the intelligence briefings had made clear what awaited them. Saipan was different from every other island the Marines had assaulted in the Pacific. This wasn't occupied territory like Guadalcanal or Tarawa. Saipan was considered part of Japan itself, having been under Japanese control since World War I. The island had been colonized in the 20s and 30s, with thousands of Japanese civilians living alongside the garrison. Emperor Hirohito called it his treasure, the bulwark protecting the home islands. The Japanese would defend it with suicidal determination. The garrison included 32,000 Imperial Army and Navy troops under Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, plus thousands of armed civilians. American intelligence had initially estimated only 15,000 defenders. But Tachovsky knew intelligence estimates were usually wrong. The island measured 14 miles long and 5 miles wide, with Mount Tapashau rising 1,500 feet in the center, providing the Japanese with observation posts that overlooked every beach. The enemy had spent months building concrete pillboxes, interconnected trenches, and underground bunkers throughout the island. They'd registered every beach and valley for artillery and mortar fire. American casualties were expected to exceed 50%. Marine planners had calculated that Scout Sniper casualties in the Pacific Theater averaged 73%. Nearly 3 out of 4 men who did what the 40 Thieves were about to do wouldn't survive. Tachovsky looked at the men behind him in the Higgins boat and wondered how many would still be alive 24 hours from now. The ramp dropped. Chest-deep water surged into the boat. Japanese machine gun fire kicked up spray in white plumes all around them. Tachovsky led his men forward through the surf at 8:47 inches the morning. The beach was already littered with bodies. Marines cut down before they could reach cover. Mortars began landing among the assault waves. Men died in the water, on the sand, at the seawall that ran parallel to the beach. The 40 Thieves moved inland fast. Their orders were simple: keep moving, find the Japanese, radio their positions, stay alive. Standard doctrine called for units to consolidate their positions and wait for support. Tachovsky's orders were different. His platoon would operate independently, advancing ahead of the main assault force to identify enemy positions before regular Marine units encountered them. By 9:30 inches the morning, they'd pushed 300 yards inland, farther than any other Marine unit on the beach. They found themselves alone in enemy territory, with 32,000 Japanese soldiers somewhere in the jungle ahead. Night would fall in 9 hours. That was when their real mission would begin. The platoon moved through dense jungle growth, maintaining 50 yards distance between men, using hand signals Tachovsky had developed during training. At 10:15, Sergeant William Nuppel spotted the first Japanese position, a concrete pillbox built into the side of a ridge, with interlocking fields of fire covering the valley below where the 2nd Marine Division would advance later that afternoon. The pillbox housed a Type 92 heavy machine gun with a crew of 7. The Japanese had camouflaged it with vegetation and positioned it to remain invisible from the beach. Marine assault units advancing through the valley would walk directly into the kill zone. Tachovsky's map showed 3 possible routes for the Marine advance. The Japanese machine gun covered all 3. Taking out the position would save dozens, possibly hundreds of Marine lives. But attacking it would reveal the 40 Thieves' location and compromise their reconnaissance mission. Tachovsky made his decision in 30 seconds. Private Marvin Strombo positioned himself 80 yards from the pillbox with a bazooka, while the rest of the platoon provided security. At 10:32, Strombo fired 1 round. The rocket hit the pillbox's firing slit and detonated inside, killing the entire Japanese crew instantly. Before the smoke cleared, the 40 Thieves had already moved 300 yards deeper into the jungle. They left no trace of their presence, except the destroyed pillbox. When 2nd Marine Division units advanced through that valley 4 hours later, they encountered no machine gun fire from the ridge. They never knew what had been waiting for them there. Never knew that 40 men had already cleared the way. By noon, the 40 Thieves had identified and mapped 17 Japanese positions, 8 machine gun nests, 4 mortar pits, 3 artillery observation posts, and 2 ammunition storage areas. Tachovsky radioed the coordinates back to regimental headquarters using encoded transmissions. Within 20 minutes, naval gunfire from destroyers offshore began hitting the targets. 5-inch shells demolished Japanese fortifications the 40 Thieves had marked 30 minutes earlier. This was their mission. Find the enemy, mark them for destruction, and move on before the Japanese realized what was happening. The platoon's advance carried them 2 miles inland by early afternoon, well ahead of any other American unit. They moved through terrain the Marines wouldn't reach for 3 more days. Every 100 yards revealed new Japanese positions. The island was more heavily fortified than intelligence had estimated. Tachovsky counted over 200 enemy soldiers in one valley alone, dug into positions that would take days of frontal assault to capture. But with accurate coordinates, naval gunfire could destroy those positions in minutes. At 3:40 inches the afternoon, the platoon discovered something unexpected: a Japanese tank battalion staging area. 37 Type 97 medium tanks sat under camouflage netting in a grove north of Chiran-Kanoa. Marine intelligence had estimated the Japanese possessed maybe a dozen tanks on Saipan. The 40 Thieves had just found 3 times that number in one location. The tanks represented the most serious threat to the American beachhead. Japanese doctrine called for massed tank attacks at night when American naval gunfire would be less effective. If these 37 tanks attacked the beach after dark, they could potentially break through marine lines and reach the vulnerable supply areas where ammunition, fuel, and medical stations clustered. The entire invasion could collapse in a single evening. Tachovsky immediately radioed the coordinates. The response from headquarters came back within 8 minutes. Naval gunfire was already engaged, supporting Marine units pinned down near the beach. Airstrikes were committed to other targets. Artillery was still being unloaded from ships. No assets were available to hit the tank battalion for at least 4 hours. By then it would be dark, and the tanks would likely have moved. Tachovsky looked at the 37 tanks and made a calculation. His platoon carried 6 bazookas, 6 rounds per bazooka. 36 rockets total, 37 tanks. The mathematics were almost perfect, except for one problem. A 40-man unit does not attack a tank battalion and survive. But Tachovsky hadn't recruited Marines who followed conventional tactics. He'd recruited men who fought dirty and lived. At 4:15, he gave the order to prepare for assault. If they succeeded, they would prevent a potential disaster at the beachhead. If they failed, 40 men would die, and no one would ever know what happened to them in that jungle grove. Then, at 4:25, something changed. The tanks started their engines. The sound of 37 diesel engines roaring to life simultaneously echoed through the jungle. Japanese tank crews emerged from camouflage dugouts and climbed onto their vehicles. Officers shouted orders. Infantry units began forming up around the tanks. This wasn't a repositioning movement. This was preparation for attack. And it was happening earlier than intelligence had predicted. The window for surprise had closed. Attacking now would accomplish nothing except getting his men killed. Tachovsky made a new decision: shadow the tank battalion and report its movements. He radioed headquarters with updated information. The response came back immediately. Maintain observation. Do not engage. Continue reporting. The tank battalion began moving at 5-7 inches the evening, advancing in 2 columns along parallel routes toward the coast, with approximately 1,000 infantry soldiers moving alongside. This was a major assault designed to break through Marine lines and reach the beaches before nightfall. The 40 Thieves followed the enemy formation, staying 200 yards to the flank and using jungle cover for concealment. Every 10 minutes, Tachovsky radioed updated coordinates. Marine units at the beach began repositioning to meet the threat. Bazookas were distributed to frontline units. Sherman tanks from the 2nd Marine Tank Battalion moved forward. Artillery batteries adjusted their aim points. At 6:15, approximately 1 mile from the beach, the Japanese formation halted. Officers gathered for a conference. Tachovsky observed them through binoculars from 300 yards away. The officers were arguing, pointing in different directions, unrolling maps. The conference lasted 11 minutes. Finally, they returned to their units, and the formation changed direction, turning north instead of continuing toward the beach. By 7:05, as the sun touched the horizon, Tachovsky understood their plan. The Japanese weren't attacking the main beachhead. They were targeting the gap between the 2nd Marine Division and 4th Marine Division. A successful breakthrough there would split American forces in half. But the Japanese had chosen their timing perfectly. Dusk was falling. Radio communication was becoming difficult. And the gap between divisions was defended by just 2 Marine companies, approximately 340 men against 37 tanks and 1,000 infantry. At 7:23, the Japanese attack began. The 40 Thieves watched from elevated ground as enemy tanks rolled forward through the twilight. Marine defensive positions erupted with bazooka fire. The first 3 Japanese tanks exploded in flames, but 34 more kept coming. Japanese infantry charged behind the tanks, screaming and firing. Marines fell back from their initial positions. Then Tachovsky saw something that changed everything. One Japanese tank had separated from the main formation and was heading directly toward the 6th Marine Regiment's command post, where Colonel Rizley was coordinating the entire divisional response. The Type 97 tank moved through the darkness at approximately 15 miles per hour, following a ravine that led directly to the command post. If it reached that location, it could destroy radio equipment, kill senior officers, and paralyze the entire regimental response. Tachovsky grabbed Private Herbert Hodges, the best bazooka shooter in the platoon, and they ran down the slope at full speed, racing to intercept the tank. They reached a position 30 yards from the tank's projected path at 7:31. Hodges dropped prone and aimed. The tank emerged from the ravine 20 seconds later, its turret rotating, searching for targets. The commander stood in the open hatch with binoculars. Hodges waited. A moving tank was harder to hit. He needed the perfect moment. The tank continued forward. 25 yards, 20 yards, 15 yards. Then it stopped. The engine idled. The commander was checking his map. Hodges fired at 7:32. The rocket hit the tank's left side, just below the turret ring, where the armor was thinnest. The shaped charge penetrated and detonated inside the crew compartment. All 4 crew members died instantly. 6 seconds later, the tank's ammunition cooked off, and the entire vehicle erupted in flames. The fireball lit up the jungle for 300 yards. Japanese infantry advancing nearby saw the explosion and assumed they'd encountered a major Marine defensive position. They redirected their assault away from the command post and toward what they thought was a larger threat. Tachovsky's single bazooka shot had inadvertently misdirected an entire Japanese infantry battalion. But the muzzle flash had revealed their position to every Japanese soldier within 500 yards. Enemy machine gun fire began raking the area. Mortar rounds started falling. The 40 Thieves had to withdraw immediately or risk being overrun. The withdrawal through jungle in darkness while under fire tested everything they'd trained for. The platoon split into small teams of 4 or 5 men each, moving independently toward predetermined rally points. Japanese patrols were everywhere, searching for the Marines who destroyed their tank. Several times, teams found themselves within yards of enemy soldiers. They relied on silent movement and concealment rather than engaging. One firefight would reveal their position and bring overwhelming response. Private Strombo's team encountered a Japanese patrol at 8:05. 7 enemy soldiers moving through the jungle with flashlights. Strombo and 3 other Marines lay motionless in undergrowth as the patrol passed within 10 feet of their position. One Japanese soldier stopped and looked directly at the spot where Strombo was hiding. He stood there for 43 seconds, staring into the darkness. Finally, he moved on. By 9 o'clock that evening, approximately half the 40 Thieves had reached the primary rally point. Tachovsky counted 23 men. 17 were still missing. They could be dead, captured, or simply lost in the darkness. Standard procedure called for units to wait at rally points for up to 2 hours. But enemy patrols were actively searching the area. Tachovsky decided to move the assembled group back to Marine lines and send rescue teams after dawn. The group approached friendly positions carefully at 9:41, using pre-arranged recognition signals. Nervous sentries challenged them. Tachovsky responded with the correct password. 23 men had made it back. 17 were still out there somewhere in the dark. The Japanese tank attack continued through the night. By dawn, on June 16th, the enemy had lost 27 of their 37 tanks. The attack had failed, but it had cost the Marines heavily. The 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines reported 78 casualties. Company F had 19 killed or wounded. The gap between divisions had held, but barely. Tachovsky assembled search teams at first light. They found the first body at 7:05. Private Donald Evans had been shot twice in the chest during the withdrawal. He died instantly. His dog tags were missing. The Japanese often collected American dog tags as trophies. The team buried Evans in a shallow grave marked with his rifle and helmet. The second team found 3 more bodies at 8:20. These Marines had been captured alive, then executed. Their hands were tied behind their backs. They'd been bayoneted. Japanese forces on Saipan rarely took prisoners, considering surrender dishonorable and extending that contempt to enemy soldiers who fell into their hands. By 10 o'clock, search teams had located 6 of the missing Marines alive. They'd become separated during the night withdrawal but had successfully evaded Japanese patrols. That brought the count to 29 men accounted for. 13 were still missing. At 11:15, one search team made radio contact. They'd found 5 more Marines hiding in a cave system approximately 1 mile behind Japanese lines. The Marines were alive but pinned down by enemy patrols. One had malaria and was running a fever of 103 degrees. Another had dysentery and could barely walk. Both needed immediate medical attention. Tachovsky assembled a 6-man rescue team and moved out at 11:47. They reached the cave system at 12:33 and distributed water and medical supplies to the trapped men. Then they prepared to move, knowing they had to cover 1 mile through Japanese-controlled territory in broad daylight. Standard tactics called for moving in darkness, but the sick Marines couldn't survive another 12 hours without evacuation. They made it 400 yards before encountering a Japanese patrol, 20 enemy soldiers in a standard search formation. Tachovsky had 2 choices: hide and hope the patrol passed, or ambush them and eliminate the threat. Hiding risked discovery. Ambushing risked bringing more Japanese troops. He chose ambush. The element of surprise would give them a brief advantage. The Marines positioned themselves in a classic L-shaped ambush formation. At 1:23, the Japanese walked directly into the kill zone. Tachovsky gave the signal. 11 Marines opened fire simultaneously. The Japanese patrol was destroyed in 7 seconds. 20 enemy soldiers killed. No survivors. No radio transmissions. But the gunfire had been heard for at least half a mile. Japanese units throughout the area would be converging on this location within minutes. The Marines moved at a full run, abandoning stealth for speed. Behind them, Japanese voice shouted commands. Whistles blew. Tachovsky estimated they had maybe 5 minutes before Japanese forces surrounded them. The nearest Marine defensive position was 800 yards away across open ground. Running that distance while carrying 2 sick Marines would take at least 12 minutes. The Japanese would catch them before they reached safety. At 1:29, they encountered an unexpected obstacle. The terrain ahead dropped into a steep ravine, 40 feet deep, with near vertical sides. Going around would add 15 minutes. Staying on the ridge meant certain contact with pursuing Japanese forces. Tachovsky chose the ravine. They descended, half sliding and half climbing, supporting the 2 sick men between them. They reached the bottom at 1:33. Japanese soldiers appeared on the ridge above them 60 seconds later and opened fire from elevated positions. Bullets ricocheted off rocks. One Marine was hit in the leg. Another took shrapnel from a grenade. The Marines returned fire while continuing to move, using boulders and vegetation for cover. The ravine channeled them in one direction, eliminating tactical options. At 1:38, they spotted the problem. The ravine ended in a box canyon. No exit. Japanese soldiers began descending from multiple points, moving to surround them. Tachovsky counted at least 40 enemy soldiers visible, with more arriving every minute. Then Tachovsky noticed something the Japanese had missed. The box canyon's rear wall wasn't solid rock. Vegetation growing at the base suggested water seepage, which meant a crack in the stone. He sent 2 Marines to investigate. They reported back at 1:44 there was a narrow opening behind the vegetation, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Beyond the opening, a fissure widened into a passageway that appeared to lead upward through the rock. The Marines began moving through the opening one at a time, removing their packs and dragging them behind. The passage was completely dark. They moved by touch, following the man ahead. Behind them, they could hear Japanese soldiers entering the box canyon, calling to each other as they searched. The passage emerged on the opposite side of the ridge at 27, 400 yards from where they'd entered. The Marines found themselves behind Japanese lines, but with the enemy focused on searching the ravine below. They moved quickly toward Marine positions, covering the final 600 yards in 8 minutes. At 2:23, all 11 Marines crossed into American-held territory. The 2 sick men were immediately evacuated to medical stations. That brought the total count to 34 Marines accounted for. 8 remained missing. As the day progressed, 3 more were found alive. 2 more bodies were discovered by advancing Marine units. 3 Marines remained unaccounted for by nightfall on June 16th and were officially listed as missing in action. The 40 Thieves had lost at least 6 men killed in their first 48 hours on Saipan, with 3 more missing and presumed dead. That represented a 22% casualty rate. Despite the losses, the platoon had accomplished its mission. They'd identified over 200 Japanese positions, called in coordinates that destroyed dozens of enemy fortifications, prevented a tank from reaching the regimental command post, and provided critical intelligence on enemy movements. At 1800 hours, Colonel Rizley sent a message to Tachovsky. The 40 Thieves would have 1 night to rest, resupply, and integrate replacements. At dawn on June 17th, they would return to the jungle. Their next mission would take them even deeper behind enemy lines. At 5:30 the following morning, the platoon moved out in complete darkness. Their objective was a ridge system 3 miles inland that Marine intelligence believed contained Japanese artillery positions. Those guns had been shelling American positions continuously for 2 days, killing dozens of Marines and disrupting supply operations. Aerial reconnaissance couldn't locate the guns because the Japanese had camouflaged them inside caves. Only ground reconnaissance could find them. They covered the first mile in 47 minutes without encountering Japanese patrols. The second mile took longer as terrain became increasingly difficult. They reached the target ridge at 8:15 and began systematic reconnaissance. Tachovsky counted 8 cave entrances large enough to hide artillery pieces. The caves were connected by tunnels that allowed the Japanese to move guns between positions, fire several rounds, then relocate before American counterfire could respond. At 9:40, Corporal Roscoe Mullins and Private Strombo volunteered to penetrate the cave system, while the rest of the platoon provided security. The 2 Marines entered the largest cave opening and moved into darkness using small, shielded flashlights. The cave extended 200 feet into the ridge before branching into multiple passages. They could hear Japanese voices echoing from somewhere deeper in the system. They found the first artillery piece at 10:12, a Type 91 105mm howitzer positioned 30 feet inside a side passage, with ammunition stored in recesses carved into the rock walls. The gun crew was absent, probably sleeping. Mullins and Strombo marked the location and continued deeper. They discovered 2 more guns in the next 40 minutes, plus a command post, an ammunition magazine containing approximately 2,000 rounds, and sleeping quarters for at least 60 soldiers. The tunnel system was far more extensive than intelligence had estimated. At 11:03, they heard Japanese soldiers approaching. Mullins and Strombo had maybe 15 seconds to find concealment. They pressed themselves into a small alcove and remained motionless as a dozen enemy soldiers walked past. conversing in Japanese. The soldiers passed within 3 feet without detecting the Americans. After the patrol moved on, the 2 Marines decided to exit. They'd gathered enough intelligence. They emerged at 11:27 and rejoined the platoon. Tachovsky examined their map. The tunnel system connected all 8 cave entrances and contained at least 6 artillery pieces, possibly more. Standard Marine assault tactics would fail against this position. The only solution was to seal the entrances and systematically destroy each position with demolitions. But that required Marine engineers with explosives, and those units were still days away. At 12:15, the platoon began moving toward their secondary objective, the town of Garapan, Saipan's administrative capital before the war. Marine intelligence wanted to know if Japanese forces were defending the town or if they'd withdrawn to more defensible positions inland. Reaching Garapan required crossing 4 miles of enemy-controlled territory in broad daylight. But the 40 Thieves had successfully operated, undetected, for over 30 hours. Tachovsky believed they could complete one more reconnaissance mission. They approached Garapan from the east at 3:40 inches the afternoon. The town had been heavily bombed and shelled. Most buildings were destroyed or damaged, but they could see Japanese soldiers moving through the ruins. At 4:05, Tachovsky made a decision that would become legendary in Marine Corps history. 5 Marines would enter Garapan in broad daylight, conduct reconnaissance, and return with intelligence. Tachovsky selected 4 Marines: Strombo, Mullins, Corporal William Rixey, and Private Don Evans. 5 men, total, including himself. They removed all equipment that might make noise and carried only rifles, knives, and sidearms. At 4:23, they moved toward Garapan's eastern edge. The ruins provided excellent cover but also concealed Japanese positions. They entered the town at 4:41, moving through back streets and staying in shadows. Japanese soldiers were everywhere. They counted at least 200 enemy troops visible in the town center, with probably hundreds more in surrounding buildings. The Japanese weren't defending Garapan as a fortified position. They were using it as a staging area for counterattacks. The distinction was important. Marine commanders planning to assault Garapan needed to know they would face mobile enemy units rather than fixed fortifications. At 5:08, Rixey spotted something unexpected: 5 bicycles leaning against a partially destroyed building. Japanese military bicycles, the type officers used for transportation between positions. An idea formed immediately. 5 bicycles, 5 Marines. They could conduct their reconnaissance while riding through town like Japanese soldiers moving between positions. In the chaos and destruction of Garapan, 5 men on bicycles would attract less attention than 5 men on foot trying to hide. The plan violated every standard reconnaissance procedure. Tachovsky approved it instantly. The Marines took the bicycles and began riding through Garapan at 5:15. They moved casually, not trying to hide. Japanese troops ignored them. Some waved. Others shouted greetings in Japanese that the Marines didn't understand but acknowledged with hand gestures. For 43 minutes, the 40 Thieves rode through the enemy capital on stolen bicycles, mapping positions, counting troops, and identifying supply dumps. They passed within yards of Japanese officers who never suspected the Americans riding past were enemy reconnaissance. At 5:58, they completed their circuit and exited the town, heading north. They continued riding for another mile before abandoning the bicycles and moving back into the jungle. The reconnaissance had provided detailed intelligence on enemy dispositions throughout Garapan. Marine commanders would know exactly where Japanese forces were concentrated when they eventually assaulted the town. The 40 Thieves reached Marine lines at 7:32 that evening. They'd been behind enemy lines for 14 hours and had penetrated deeper into Japanese territory than any other American unit. Over the next 3 weeks, the platoon continued similar missions. They mapped enemy positions throughout Saipan's interior, called in coordinates for artillery strikes, ambushed Japanese patrols, and provided intelligence that saved countless Marine lives. They witnessed Japanese atrocities, civilians forced to jump from cliffs rather than surrender, wounded Marines used as bait for ambushes, prisoners executed. The platoon operated in small teams, sometimes for days without contact with Marine units. They suffered from malaria, dysentery, heat exhaustion, and tropical diseases. They ran out of food and stole from Japanese supply dumps. They ran out of water and drank from contaminated streams. By July 9th, when Saipan was declared secure after 24 days of fighting, the 40 Thieves had lost 12 men killed and 9 wounded. That represented a 56% casualty rate, devastating, but below the 73% average for scout sniper units in the Pacific Theater. The survivors were physically and mentally exhausted. Most had lost 30 to 40 pounds. Several had malaria fevers. All had seen things that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But they had accomplished their mission. Marine commanders estimated the 40 Thieves' reconnaissance work had reduced overall Marine casualties by at least 15%, potentially saving 2,000 lives during the battle that claimed more than 3,000 American dead and 13,000 wounded. The battle had also resulted in the deaths of approximately 29,000 Japanese troops and 8,000 civilians in one of the most brutal campaigns of the Pacific War. Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky was awarded the Silver Star for his actions on Saipan. The 40 Thieves would go on to fight at Tinian in July 1944, continuing their deep reconnaissance operations. After the war, most members struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Many had recurring nightmares. Some turned to alcohol. Several couldn't maintain civilian employment or personal relationships. The psychological cost of their service was never officially recognized or treated during their lifetimes. Frank Tachovsky returned to civilian life and eventually became mayor of Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. He never spoke about the war, not even to his family. His son Joseph only learned about the 40 Thieves after finding his father's footlocker following his death in 2011. Inside were maps, photographs, and documents that told the story of a platoon that had changed Marine Corps tactics but remained largely unknown for 66 years. The Scout Sniper Platoon of the 6th Marine Regiment was one of the first elite special operations units in American military history. Their tactics of deep reconnaissance, silent killing, and independent operations behind enemy lines would directly influence the development of modern Special Forces units, including Navy SEALs and Marine Force reconnaissance. They proved that small, highly trained units operating with autonomy could accomplish missions that entire battalions could not. 40 men recruited from brigs and punishment details. Men the Marine Corps had labeled troublemakers and criminals, became one of the most effective combat units in the Pacific War. They weren't saints and they weren't Boy Scouts. They were something more valuable. Survivors who understood that war demanded not obedience but adaptability. Not regulations but results. Not proper procedure but whatever it took to complete the mission and bring their brothers home alive. The Marines who'd called them criminals were wrong. They were warriors. And on the beaches and in the jungles of Saipan, they wrote a chapter of military history that deserves to be remembered.